It's been about 6 months since the release of the long-awaited and even longer-rumored Resident Evil 4 remake. Considering the legendary acclaim and nostalgic adoration the original received and continues to receive, there were a lot of doubts about whether or not the remake could deliver an experience that had enough of its own meaningful changes that would allow it to stand apart as its own entity, while also not changing so much that it doesn't resemble its predecessor. It's a difficult balancing act that some remakes fail to hit, but fortunately for us Resident Evil fans, the remake succeeded at the task with flying colors. I reviewed the base game when it came out, and without mincing words, I loved it. I played through it several times before I even published the review. And I know I'm not alone in this. I've seen plenty of people confess their surprise at how great the final product ended up being. Not only did it maintain the spirit of the original game with its lean towards action and campy cutscenes, it also still managed to leverage the impressive power of the RE engine to bolster the atmosphere and scares. Many people thought the game would have to choose between a tone faithful to the original or a more straightforward, no-nonsense horror focus. But few expected the game to instead choose both. On top of that, the map was redesigned with more interconnectivity between areas, giving more reasons for players to backtrack for rewards. There's also the addition of the awesome parry mechanic, where Leon is able to deflect physical attacks with finesse and follow up with a devastating melee counter. And, as the cherry on top, the Mercenaries minigame came back in its original form. Basically, the remake was a home run in every practical respect. It feels like only yesterday everyone was lamenting how much of a waste of effort the game would be and how it would end up failing to meet anyone's expectations due to the mountainous status of the original. But the journey still wasn't over. Despite how great the remake was, there was still some discourse over one certain aspect: removed content. While it was 90% faithful to the original game, this new iteration had some notable absences. There was no gondola section, no laser hallway, no castle sewers, and no U3 boss fight. It was quite strange, but I didn't really mind those removals because the game's pacing was ultimately unaffected, if not improved. But one other thing that was excluded was the popular Separate Ways extra mission, an expansion where players control Ada Wong during the events of the normal story. Of course, I was on the side of people who had to remind everyone else that the original GameCube release of RE4 also did not have Separate Ways, and it was instead introduced in the PS2 version of the game, so it totally stood to reason that it would return again as DLC. And lo and behold, it did. And with it was a free update to the base game that added Ada and Albert Wesker as playable characters in the Mercenaries. So even if you decide to not buy Separate Ways for some reason, you can still enjoy playing as the enigmatic agent anyway. It is very rare of me to do a video review of DLC, but of course, being the big fan of RE4 and Resident Evil in general that I am, I purchased Separate Ways the moment it came out. I've completed it, and now I want to talk about it. So without any more stalling, let's dive into the review. Separate Ways takes place simultaneously during the events of the base game's story, throughout Leon Kennedy's mission to rescue Ashley Graham, the US president's daughter, from the clutches of Los Illuminados, a malicious cult bent on infecting and controlling the world with a mind-altering parasite. But instead of playing as Leon, we take control of the mysterious spy for hire, Ada Wong, as she travels through the same locations to retrieve a sample of the amber containing the Las Plagas parasite so she can return it to her employer, Albert Wesker. Along the way, she has frequent run-ins with Luis Serra and Leon himself. With the Separate Ways episode, we get a deeper dive into Ada's activities, as well as all the context surrounding her mission and what led her to those specific spots we kept seeing her at in the base game. Right off the bat, I want to bring up and add to a point I made in my review for the base game, which is how much better the character writing is than in the original game. Yes, the original game is the origin point for some memorable scenes and moments, but I always felt that it was in spite of how two-dimensional most of the supporting cast was, not because of it. The remake remedied this by giving all characters not only more distinct personalities, but also giving them more opportunities to interact with one another and provide greater insight into their backgrounds and motivations. On top of that, the remake is absolutely littered with lore and exposition-heavy documents you find scattered all over the place. So even if you still find the context provided in cutscenes to be unfulfilling, you still have a small book's worth of extra details to read. I'm glad to say that Separate Ways continues this trend. Ada has a lot more interaction with both Luis and Wesker than I was expecting, including a chapter where Luis accompanies you as an AI partner for about half of it. And there's several more lore documents for her to pick up throughout her mission as well. Unfortunately, there's no extra stuff involving Leon, but that's only because we saw all of their interactions already in the base game. The next thing to touch on is the map design, and I actually think this is where the DLC truly expresses its value. While the original Separate Ways was still a pretty fun time, that was mostly because of the gameplay elements that always existed. It ultimately still felt like an asset flip, thrown together quickly and dirtily to take advantage of the GameCube version's immense success and popularity, and giving people an excuse to buy the game a second time on the PlayStation 2. The original Separate Ways offered quite little in the way of new assets beyond cutscenes and Ada's own animations and such. But Remakes Separate Ways takes some pretty great strides to set itself up as a more worthwhile companion to its attached game. You do revisit several areas that you get to experience as Leon, that much is true. A large portion of both the village and castle are accessible to Ada, but there's also a significant amount of new places that are unique to the Separate Ways episode that we never saw in the main story, including the sewers underneath the castle, the falling rock pillar corridors, and new sections of the island that feature the relocated gondola ride and the legendary laser hallway. They're all really good areas and implementations into the Remakes version of the world, and they help this DLC stand on its own 2 feet as its own experience. The laser hallway sequence even has a new set-piece enemy to add tension to the scene. And speaking of enemies, specifically bosses, many people's theory as to why U3 was absent from the base game ended up being true. It was relocated to Separate Ways, and not only as a singular fight, but a reoccurring one as a sort of pseudo-pursuer enemy you fight at every location in the game before the final showdown. Also, the climactic fight itself is a bit different and, in my opinion, much more fun and interesting, divided into 2 distinct phases that mix both the original fight in the classic game and elements of the encounter with Verdugo as Leon. The container puzzle from the original game has been replaced with an arena fight with a Garrador, a change that I honestly don't have any strong feelings on, as I never had that much of an attachment to the container sequence anyway. An early boss fight that I really enjoyed though was against a Gigante in the farm area of the village, which occurs while Leon and Luis were surviving the cabin sequence. It's an awesome encounter that utilizes Ada's grappling hook and lets you fight the beast from the roofs of the buildings as it tries to knock them over. And the buildings actually do have destruction states and physics. It's a sudden increase to scale that I honestly didn't expect. Other cool new areas of note unique to the DLC are a treasure room and art room in the castle, and various extensions of the lab Leon goes through on the island. Now let's get to the gameplay. The foundation of the experience remains pretty much the same. You visit the village, castle, and island, you explore and pick up ammo, healing items, and treasure along the way, and you sell the treasure to our friend, the merchant, to purchase or upgrade weapons. Pretty standard stuff you would expect for a DLC, but there are some key differences, especially regarding combat. Ada, being a spy with access to interesting gadgets Leon doesn't use, has a few tricks up her sleeve to get her around. The biggest game changer is the aforementioned grappling hook. Not only is it used for traversal, but it also has its place in fights too. In fact, it's bordering on a weapon all on its own. When Ada shoots an enemy in the face or legs to open them up for a melee counter, she closes the distance with the grappling hook, giving a lot of sway for how often a melee follow-up is actually viable to perform. In specific circumstances, you can even use the grappling hook melee on an enemy in front of you to escape harm from enemies you know are coming up from behind. But its usefulness still doesn't stop there. When you reach a certain part of the game, you unlock a charm, which you buy from the merchant, that allows her to use her hook to rip shields out of the hands of enemies, saving time and valuable ammo when you see them. It's such a great tool that it's actually kind of puzzling as to why they made it a charm at all. There's also the arsenal available for Ada to use. Being a DLC that's only about a third the length of the base game, she doesn't have as many firearms at her disposal as Leon does, nor does she really need it. The available selection of the Blacktail, Red 9, bolt-action rifle, Stingray, TMP, pump-action shotgun, and explosive arrows is more than enough to get you through the mission. And of course, they still have their own exclusive upgrades too. One new mechanic that the remake offered was the option for stealth. You can now crouch and sneak up on enemies for a quick, silent kill. But in Leon's story, opportunities for an effective stealth approach were pretty few and far between. In Separate Ways, it feels like chances to whittle enemy numbers down with sneaking were more common and more effective. Essentially, playing as Ada is just as satisfying and fun as playing as Leon, arguably more so with the addition of the grappling hook. And before I close out this review, I might as well mention playing as Wesker in Mercenaries. I mean, what is there to discuss? He has a handgun and a magnum to blow enemies away, sure, but what really makes him a kick-ass character to play is his inhuman speed and bare-handed melee capabilities. When you activate Mayhem mode, he just starts beating the utter shit out of everything with his fists and feet, just as he did in the original game. How sick is that? Overall, Separate Ways is an awesome piece of DLC, and one of the best $10 you can spend, assuming you already own Resident Evil 4. Depending on difficulty and how leisurely your pace is, it could take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to complete. It has every strength that the base game has, but with the added bonus of a couple cool new mechanics exclusive to Ada. It's a fantastic addition to the remake, and only serves to bolster the value of the complete experience. While there's still some debate as to whether the remake base game is better than the original base game, I don't think any such argument exists here. In almost every conceivable way, the new Separate Ways is absolutely a major improvement over the original, which, while still pretty fun, was a hastily thrown together asset flip. Now, the only question that remains is where the Resident Evil franchise will go from here, especially the remake series. With Separate Ways reintroducing him, I wonder how Wesker's story will change. People have been assuming that Code Veronica is going to be skipped over entirely, but now I'm not so sure. I'm pondering the chances of its story being reworked to take place closer to the events of 4, perhaps even right before it. That way, there will be a closer tie-in to Resident Evil 5, where Wesker is the main antagonist. Or maybe, and this is quite a long shot here, Code Veronica will be condensed into a sort of prologue for the Resident Evil 5 remake. It's kinda hard to tell right now, but with Wesker getting so much attention in 4 and Separate Ways, it's easy to imagine Capcom creating a new focus surrounding him. Regardless of what happens, Resident Evil's current trajectory continues to be promising and high quality. I look forward to what the next entry has to offer. This concludes my review of Resident Evil 4 Separate Ways. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.